Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to another episode of the Koopcast. As always, I'm your humble host, Coach Jason Koop, and on this episode of the podcast, back for her second appearance, is none other than Dr. Kristin Keim, who is a clinical psychologist as well as a sports psychologist that just happens to work with a lot of the top endurance athletes in the world today. And I wanted to bring Kristin back on the podcast to discuss this very specific issue that a lot of ultra runners are currently dealing with now that the race season is back upon us, and that is performance anxiety. This is something that can be crippling not only during the event or the days before the event, but also in the weeks and sometimes even months before the event actually unfolds. And I wanted to bring Kristin on the podcast today to give the listeners a little bit of a toolkit and some guidelines to use if you happen to be one of those athletes that notices yourself getting a little bit more nervous or having a little bit more anxiety than you should as these races start to roll around. As with anything in sports psychology, some of these elements are very esoteric, and so you're not going to find a take step one, then step two, then step three type of approach. But what we wanted to portray overall is this system of looking at your values and how those values tie into your racing life. I always love conversations with Kristin, and sometimes they go on way too long. And fortunately, Kristin had a heart out that actually provided the conclusion of this particular podcast. We started out talking about that, so I'm going to get right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Dr. Kristin Keim, all about performance anxiety. Be mindful of your heart out, because otherwise this is going to take until Friday. Thanks for coming back on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Seriously.
This is super fun. You know, it's as the cosmos always works out in the way that it should. Mm-hmm. We kind of got connected back when I was trying to get you this book that got lost to the UPS. And I just happened to have this thought around performance anxiety because this season is starting to kick off. The ultra running season is starting to kick off.
And you're having season.
Well, and exactly, you knew exactly where I was going with this. And for many athletes,
or not, things still, because the fires and whatever, things are getting canceled still.
Yeah. But for a lot of athletes out there, they're kind of looking at this going, oh my God, I haven't raced in 2 years.
Exactly.
And when you combine that fact with ultra running has this kind of weird proposition anyway, where we don't race all that frequently. Right.
Oh, well, you can't.
Yeah, you can. And ironically enough, ultra runners kind of get dinged around for racing too much. And I'm like, well, let's look at mountain bike cohorts and triathlete cohorts and things like that. It's really you got to make sure who you're comparing yourself to.
Right.
But we don't race very frequently, which is a tool that you can use to help curb performance anxiety. But also there's this really fascinating component of ultra marathon running that I really love. And then some athletes learn how to cope with this very well, and other athletes struggle with it a lot, is that the space of time between any of your longest training activities and the race is so big. Mm-hmm. And it's that part becomes very difficult for athletes to internalize, and it manifests in this really interesting way where they always ask, what should my longest long run be? And I'm like, well, if you're doing a 100-mile race, it's kind of immaterial whether your longest long run is 40 miles or 50 miles. It's extra 10, that's not going to make a difference in the entirety of the training program.
You could do ultra, but never run that mile to do well at racing the ultra. Same thing with the bike. You don't necessarily have to go out there and do tons of 100-mile rides,
Yeah, 100%. And so all of these things kind of forward feed into this performance anxiety concept, which I think comes out in ultra running in a lot of different ways. Okay. First off, my colleague Patrick Wilson, who I've had on the podcast as well, he and I had a really cool conversation about how anxiety itself leads into GI distress, and GI distress is such a prevalent issue within ultra marathon runners. The second of which is people just don't sleep before the race. And that's not of a big consequence in a shorter race. But when you're talking like a 20 or 30 hour race and you're missing a few hours of sleep because you're all like wound up the day before and the day before that, maybe even.
Well, that's what I was about to say. So with any of these, especially, again, the beautiful thing about the healthier, which is also not healthy, road racing is, you basically almost detrain unless you're able to like go to a training camp because, you're going to be the GC racer, right? Rider. But you don't see as much of the GI again, because your body is being more primed, and you have more opportunity to, kind of teach the body what it needs. But when you only have one race and that big gap, right, you really can't get it properly because you just physically aren't going to be doing that kind of. And again, like then cortisol levels, we all know, like there's nothing like a race versus simulation race, right? The simulation can never match. I mean, I hope that your simulation, but then I do have a lot of clients that get even probably more nervous when they're trying to do like, FTP tests or, whatever, which then again, why do them? Like if it's going to cause that much anxiety, then it cancels out any of the productivity of why to do it. And then there's the cookie cutter where, how one athlete is going to handle stress or whatever. You can coach two athletes where on paper they might have the same training program, but their body and their psychology and the social piece, right, are like 180, differences. Yeah. But yeah, it is more, again, because I'm a psychologist, but the first thing I will admit is like, we don't know shit about the brain.
Yeah.
We act like we do, which is the scariest thing. Yeah. Now that I've been in and out of the hospital with seeing tons of neurologists, having myself worked on the other side in neurology, giving neurological tests and, evaluating and writing up case reports and making assumptions. We really don't know enough about the brain, big scope. So we really don't know enough about the brain when it comes to the athlete with, now we're understanding fascia, right, is basically like a whole brain, and within our whole body, but also that brain gut component,
right?
Which I think we used to just kind of be like,
yeah.
But now it's like, no, now we actually have empirical evidence.
Yeah. And I was actually reminded of the performance anxiety piece again, popping up in different circumstances because I was reviewing some lab data that we have. Mm-hmm. And inevitably, so we have a physiology lab in here in Colorado Springs for the listeners, where we do metabolic testing, mainly lactate threshold and VO2 max testing. And the people
where do you have that done at?
Just in our office.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to, it's good to know.
Standard deal, right? Yeah. Standard metabolic test. But the people, we're bringing in all different kinds of athletes, elite athletes and regular athletes. The athletes who have never done a test before always have elevated lactate levels at the beginning of the test because they're just so nervous, right? They're just so, that nervousness starts to come out biochemically. We don't measure cortisol and things like that, but it actually starts to come out biochemically at lactate because they're just burning off more carbohydrates because of the anxiety.
Exactly.
So let's start there, right? I first want to create this like physiological overview of what performance anxiety is.
Yep.
And then once we understand that physiological overview, we can go through more of the kind of the tactical components of how athletes can view their training and then also the race to try to reduce this depending upon their situation they're in. So I'm gonna turn it over to you to go to the physiology side of it first, because I've heard you explain this before, and I think you have a very good way of doing it.
Yeah. I mean, I think what a lot of people do is they focus so much on like the day before or the night before, which is great. Hey, I'll take that. But, for any listener, you don't have to be a professional. And again, like I have athletes who, for them, work, maybe they might, the week of a main race, especially for ultra runner, that would be something that that sport would be advantageous to someone having a job and, just taking off. Personally, my vacation
is a job.
Right. It is a job. So I was going to get there, right? Where, it is a job, but when it comes to are you going to be racing every weekend and like, flying all over Europe or over the United States? Yes, there's pro runners that might have that lifestyle. But there's also a lot of longer distance and ultra athletes where, they coach or something and work remotely. But, for me, I work remotely. But I mean, there's good and bad to that, right? Boundaries, also when you're working, if you're a good coach, it's mental energy is energy. And I think we forget about that as endurance athletes is that, especially like with my college or high school athletes that are, at an age or in a sport where they're treated as if and they might actually have been veterans because they started when they were like 5 or whatever, right? The more that it's our identity, the more that we expect, we have sponsors. Again, these all create anxiety. And that word, performance anxiety, I mean, it just sounds negative, right?
Totally.
The word anxiety, where really there's good anxiety. And it's called eustress, EUSTRESS, which a lot of people just no coaches even talk about or look it up. And I actually tell athletes, like, look that up, grab a physiology book, go to a library, go online, follow, coaches that are going to like talk about this and share this. Because you got the athletes that overthink it on the technical side. And then there's the athletes that just think they can run and, they'll be good. Yeah, you might off raw talent, but raw talent usually tends to underperform, undertrain, or overtrain.
Well, I've heard this performance anxiety described as being it's kind of a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
N-shaped curve or U-shaped curve, depending upon how your x-axis is oriented, right?
Well, I look at like a necklace almost, a rainbow, where it's black, white, like hot fire white, and the black, whether this is over and under, and then you want color in between.
Correct. And the vocabulary that gets used, and you use the word eustress, that's probably a little bit more technical, but the vocabulary that I think that is more colloquial that most people identify with is the difference between arousal.
Yes, arousal. Yeah.
Performance anxiety.
Yeah.
So let's go through that transition, right? An athlete it manifests however you just described. Right. It starts off with what is the athlete, right? What is their why? And what is their objective? Like, okay, you're good. Like I was good. I was good at lots of different things, which was kind of my kryptonite. Because I didn't know what I wanted to do because I could do this at this level. I could do that at this level. But if you want to do well and like you're doing a sport like the ultra running, yes, we need to have like some cross training in there, right? But the main thing that your identity around, at least for that
I like the 3-week idea, right? Like, so what is that 3-week? So you can have performance kind of anxiety based off of, it's the wintertime and it's an excitement, right? Like it's the newness. Now we're going to have like a new plan. I can forget about last season. Or what I see is like an athlete won worlds and their winter is so stressful because media all over the place, interviews, expectation, it just is like a kryptonite. And so I think that that's where it all starts, is that there's good in between and bad of states of arousal. And so I like the inverted U, which is typically what a lot more of the sports psychology. We could do a PowerPoint and do the graphs and the pies but when athletes, so if you go to my site and any athlete can go to Keim Performance Consulting LLC, and that is actually an activity I have all my athletes do, is it's like a pie and it's more like a bullet, kind of looking thing. And then they have to like shade or on a scale of like the pain scale, on a scale of 1 to 10, there's all kinds of different ways that you can get this feedback. And I really think that whether you're doing sports psychology, you're a coach, or just an athlete that listens to podcasts, a visual idea of kind of what you want to work on can either evoke and be more stressful or take away. And I would say 9 out of 10, it actually is helpful because then those are the areas that you're going to work on. But that's kind of where we want to start, is where your objectives are. And are these objectives, goals, whatever you want to call them, are they going to actually cause more stress, right? Because the athlete is only focusing on the outcome versus the process. And are the process, so it starts way before you even are towing the white line.
Right. And I think that's where athletes go awry a little bit, is they're thinking about this as what I would describe as an acute phenomenon, something that's happening at whatever moment in time they are experiencing it. Prototypically, not all the time, but prototypically, in the way that I described it earlier in this podcast, was the day of a race or a night before the race. You're thinking about something that is triggering you, either the outcome of the race or you getting nauseous at mile 50.
I don't have my lucky socks.
I don't have my lucky socks, or kind of whatever it is. But in reality, that's a manifestation, if I'm understanding your framework correctly, that's a manifestation of something that is important to you that should have been identified weeks and months and maybe even years beforehand, that you wanted to work on. And had you gone through this process of, here's what is important to me, pie chart, bar graph, however you want to do it.
Right.
That's how you're able to control how much anxiety or arousal actually happens when you're kind of faced with that situation.
Yeah. And that's why in the off season, I like my athletes to do something that is going to make them completely vulnerable. So like, someone who's never done art or doesn't cook, so then in your off season, you're learning how to be growth mindset. Everyone will know what that means, right? Or they'll hear that. Well, that's what the growth mindset means, is that you, like some of my athletes where, honestly, they worked with me their whole career. So, they had things to work on. But the one thing that I think helped them separate themselves from, the best in the world was that they literally always their idea was just them getting better. They kind of compared because we're human, but at the end of the day, what got them excited and out of the bed was to try to break their own records or, make it up that hill climb and that was it. I can't take, that's who they are. That's why genetically, not just physiologically, but more important, genetically, and your parents, that high school coach or whatever that sparked you. It starts way before any time before that race. But I do like the 3 week or like the 2 week or whatever, because whatever you're doing 3 weeks, like Ironman championships are going in 3 weeks. So like right now, whatever my athletes are doing with me, their diet, their coaching, it's like, just stay healthy. Don't break anything, meet with me at least once a week, and not overtrain, because you want the magic to be for that one race, right?
Try not to screw it up, right?
Exactly. You already are doing your race. This is how I look at it. It's like, the race started at least 1 week before. And that's where that anxiety, because some athletes cannot sleep at all the week before. But if they were crushing 8 to 10 hours for, more often than not, which that is something good to track, then that can be that impetus that where they're like, okay, my week. Sleep has been kind of shitty this week, but I was crushing it the whole 3 months leading up to it, because we all know based off science, unless you tell yourself that is going to mess you up, it really isn't going to mess you up.
Well, and that brings me to a question that I just kind of fielded on Instagram, and this is from Brian. He asked, how does performance anxiety manifest differently pre-race versus during? And what physical and mental aspects do we see in kind of those conditions? And this kind of goes to what you were talking about, is we can't think about this as what I was just describing as an acute phenomenon. Right. It's something that's the seeds have been planted for it many weeks or maybe even years in advance.
We got to remember that depression and anxiety, people want to cut their heads off. It's a body thing. Right. So one of my athletes would get to nationals, and they raced in Europe, and they would come back home for nationals and would get dropped. And literally they were beating the world's best in the classics, and they would get dropped at the nationals. And, and then we realized they were basically racing even in Europe with one lung because they had such bad allergies.
Oh my God.
So this was Chattanooga or wherever it was. And they were literally just having asthma attacks. They didn't realize it, right? We thought it was maybe panic attacks, and it's it's not panic attacks. And then realize, luckily I'm more medically sound, and I was like, I think you're having asthma attacks, which, granted, they still would like get third place with one lung and, you know, having an asthma attack. But that's it. Like, you know, hyperventilating, you know, what comes first, the egg, the chicken, you know, it's all, and then it's all in the same pot, and it's different for others. But that is something to think about, because I know I get athletes all the time that think that, oh, I just get worried, you know, before a race. Like, it doesn't work like that. If you're worrying is that limiting, that shit is going to happen while you're taking tests. I mean, you know, then they think back and they're like, oh yeah, like I could see that, like, you know.
So there's a parallel in other aspects of their life is what
exactly. It's not just under this one umbrella.
Huh. Interesting. So to kind of describe a little bit of the framework, and I want you to take it a step further. You're starting out with who the athlete is and what's valuable to them in some proportional manner. Performance is valuable to me. Challenging is valuable to me. The social aspect.
If you don't want to do well and win, we have bigger fish to fry.
And sometimes especially for elite athletes, there's an economic incentive as well. So how do you then take that value set that you're creating with those athletes and translate it into actionable things that they can use not only to combat performance anxiety very specifically, but then perform better on race day more broadly?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, that's kind of it. I'm trained cognitive behavioral therapy is more my CBT. So we are more about like the now and the future. So that's why that mindfulness, meditation, all that's kind of in the CBT. There's other frameworks if everyone went, I was surprised when I started first down the road of psychology where, there's all these different types of therapists and theories and, philosophies and, psychodynamic. There's some tools from that I pull from, but like I always say, it's peeling an onion back. Like, I don't need to know, what went on when you were 4 years old or whatever. Maybe that is something that we eventually talk about, but in the here and now, we want to be like, okay, what are you doing right? Because, everyone's doing something, and I'm very growth. And what has happened with sport, I feel like, and I get it from my athletes, is like it's kind of like that. They forget where they were at. So like, okay, just think a year ago, you couldn't do X, Y, Z, right? And we forget about that process, which is why I love journaling, or beyond just the numbers, that what you're feeling. And so my job is to help kind of connect the brain and the body, in a way that sets that athlete up to really understanding goals or objectives and how that side job or that role of the team, if they're on a team and, maybe you're on a team and your team is actually the thing that's going to bring you down, or the coach, it's not that they're a bad person. They just, you've moved on, or they just are, it's unhealthy what they're doing. Right.
Or you don't believe in their training. We see
that a lot. That's number one.
Yeah. We see that a lot when athletes want to move from coach to coach, and it's very, very rarely a battle worth fighting, even when the coach is doing everything correctly. Like you can see all the programming is correct and things like that. If the athlete doesn't believe in whatever, whatever reason, it's like, okay, we'll figure out a solution. This is clearly not the right, coaching structure for you. Here's where I think you need to, where I think you need to go from there.
Well, and as coaches, and my job is, you've got to hold those strong boundaries where, as I always say it, like, you're not a cheerleader, like, like it's, and even me, I'm not sitting there boosting egos. Like, I'm there to teach. And oftentimes, especially my male athletes, that is the thing that they seek out, is that, they don't need to be around someone who's just going to, lie to them because they want to be cool on Instagram with them or whatever. We got to have those boundaries. And so again, that ties into performance anxiety, because again, like, there's thousands and for the little field of, sports efficacy and, actually doing research on it, you can find 15 libraries of anxiety, because again, like, every person is a unique unicorn and what they look at anxiety. And so my job and your job and the athlete's job is to figure out the like three main things. I mean, and so usually, and you may figure it out like that. It may take a few years. It may take a few sessions. I mean, I have some people that are so self-aware, they're too self-aware, right? I mean, there's a level of being too empathic or compassionate, or too focused on the numbers, which again can spike. And which I've seen is that, again, like they become such a number that they actually can go above that number, right? Because in a race, we all know you could do anything. It's kind of like if the truck falls down on you or your friend, and the mom that's 100 pounds is able to lift the truck up, right? Like that is a humanality function thing that we really can do. But that is anxiety. I mean, that is propelled of like synergy of the brain and the body, kind of just forgetting that you're human and you do become super human in a way. Which, I mean, I think that's why I steer away from that mental strength, because like mental strength looks different. And for me, the athlete that is able to, basically be told they're never going to walk again, but now they're racing competitively again, right? Is like, that's mental strength to me versus a win.
Right. Something within a race. But I want to kind of bring this back to like a little bit of a pragmatic prototype that I think a lot of athletes will, especially ultramarathon athletes, will identify with. They've done all this training going into an event. Right. Inevitably, that involves some sort of like social isolation, right? They don't get to see their family, and the husband or the wife or the partner in the relationship has to like. Give me a second. Let me kind of like build up into it, because I think you understand some of the prototype that I'm going with. It involves a lot of sacrifice.
Yes.
Because endurance activities, doesn't matter where they are.
It does. Yeah.
Doesn't matter whether you're in
bio, psycho, social. And the first piece is the bio. Yeah.
Correct. So it takes a lot of time to train. And a lot of times it interferes with their personal life. They get close to the race, and they start thinking about all the times that they've been training and all the times that they had to miss out on this or forego that or whatever other kind of sacrifice, whether it's a social sacrifice or a time sacrifice or whatever. And they think about the proposition of, well, what if I don't finish, or what if I don't get my silver buckle or whatever outcome that they have fixated on. Yep. And they're comparing the work to this theoretical outcome that hasn't happened yet. And that creates this concoction of anxiety that can be 2, 3, 4 weeks before the race, because they can think about their training and the outcome. And I'm wondering, because this is kind of like a more common situation that we can start to peel back. You already started with, they need a value set, but when you have an athlete, and you have had athletes that have been through this based on your reaction to it.
Oh, every athlete.
So what do you take them through? Like, because everybody's going to be, not everybody, but there are going to be a lot of people listening to this podcast that resonate with that exact situation.
Right. Yeah, no. And I mean, I think that's it. Autonomy plus efficacy is my equation to equal confidence. And the right objectives and the right amount of arousal or confidence and understanding, and being able to understand that, like, I did these exercises, and the why. And it starts way back where, why are you doing this exercise? Like, so your coach has you do this. Why? Right. Yeah. And just the more that you really are working on the autonomy of why you're doing certain workouts and why are you making these sacrifices. And like, I mean, and again, like my best lessons as a therapist is just every athlete that I had the privilege to work with is like a dissertation or a class for me, because I now know I can help athletes understand that, yeah, going to your buddy's bachelor party the week before, you know, tour of Utah or something, and then they win a field sprint. And I'm like, yeah, it was probably because of that. And then they want to be like, well, should I do that before every? And I'm like, no, that was one card. But we can talk about like how that was correlated, that again, you can be. And so like I empower my athletes that, you know, are overseas doing blocks to like, you know, go on a vacation or come back to America and, you know, go to that family summer lake house or beach house, you know, whatever. And so, I mean, I think like, again, we compare, which, you know, comparison is just, we're always going to compare. It's human nature. But the more that you as an athlete focus in on what workouts do you enjoy that are going to like, you can do that help you feel confident, that you have autonomy in, that you and your coach know that like, if you're in this window doing this, or even just staying healthy, like didn't have to be in a boot. I didn't get a stress fracture or, I mean, so again, like these goals or objectives, again, need to be evaluated every 3 to 5 weeks or, you know, after a race. You know, I always like athletes to, you know, write down right away, journal about the good, the bad, you know, again, never quitting, you know, like, unless it's like, again, I think it's stupid to do permanent damage just to finish a race, right? Like, but all these are actually ways that you can help that trait or state anxiety, which again, like, is it a physiological because you have a generalized anxiety disorder? And what we can see through a lot of like Tour de France riders, yes, they might have doped or done whatever, but at the end of the day, they actually did have like a mental health challenge, which right. Came first, chicken or the egg. If you already have a predisposition for, you know, an OCD or a ADHD or whatever, you have addictions. And if you have addictions, you're not going to probably make the best choices. And that's why, you know, the field of psychology, where people can get off because they, you know, claim insanity, right? That is, again, what I see with a lot of ultra runners or Ironman or endurance athletes, just like Michael Phelps or Lindsey Vonn. It's like, you know, a lot of unhealthy behaviors. Again, I can't speak to, you know, either that I wasn't their therapist, but I hypothesize that, again, like sport becomes the medicine, when actually that's where you can get yourself into trouble and actually create or bring out that more clinical issues, is because, again, you're doing the ultra, but getting to run those many miles feels good, dopamine kicks, but then that turns into the eating disorder, you know, or having more panic attacks or more stresses in your life that you might not have done if you hadn't started to do ultra running.
But the more and more that you kind of go through the dialogue, it seems like the more problematic cases or at least the origin of a lot of this performance anxiety orbits around the identity being too closely matched to the sport itself.
Yep. Self-worth.
And the interventions that you can take are many. You just mentioned one that I use a lot, which is reviewing training. Right? You can go back and look at the training. What was the purpose of this? Have you done enough training? How do you feel about it? And things like that.
And how much have they taught with the coach? I mean, a lot of times now it's just the computers. It's like there's nothing more that's going to help than to have a dialogue with your coach, and especially leading into an athlete's A game or A race, right? It's just now, do they need to text after every word? I mean, then there needs to be boundaries.
Yeah.
And that's a problem too, though, is when people are, so the coach, I would say, calls the issue because they didn't put the boundary up. And then they talk with me and they're annoyed. And I'm like, well, you let them. You became too open and willing, and it became more, as a friend buddy. And yes, I mean, I want to be a friend and be, someone to like me. There's different stages of friendship, but that it does start with those boundaries, and that it plays into that self-efficacy, which is the definition of that, right? We want the athlete to, if you were to get sick and be off the radar, that they would be able to coach themselves at 100%. Least for blocked.
Yeah. 100%. I believe in that. But let me kind of backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
So if the origin of this, if the origin of a lot of performance anxiety is really rooted in too much identity being tied to the sport or the ultimate outcome, I get that.
Their self-worth is attached.
Their self-worth is too attached to it. We got that. But there's still athletes out there that have a reasonable level of attachment to their sport. And I don't know if that's and what I'm saying is they don't have that kind of pre-existing my whole self-worth, or the majority of my self-worth is kind of wrapped up in this.
Right.
But yet they still have performance anxiety manifest itself either before or during an actual race, absent of that tie-in.
Yep.
So there's once again, there's going to be a lot of listeners out there that are, they're amateur, recreational age group, however you want to describe it, ultra runners. And I would say that they have a healthy relationship with running, but still for whatever reason have to combat that. So let's say the first step is kind of checked off, right? Mm-hmm. I have a reasonable relationship with ultra running. But
I have a coach that I believe.
I have a coach that I trust. I've done all of the training, and these things still happen either before or during the race.
Nutrition.
Okay. So go through it.
That's a big one. I mean, I can tell you, and it actually was fascinating to me because I would take an athlete and on paper, it's like, well, we should be performing at this level. Well, they were bonking. And then they were having panic attacks. Well, they were basically not eating enough because that was, again, what came first. They were too fearful to take their hands off while they're going over, massive descents or rocks or whatever, right? So then the cortisol levels were going up, and then they only had one gel for, a 2-hour, 5-hour mountain bike race or whatever it is, right? Or they were dehydrated. And so you and I know that fueling and not, and the hangries, it's actually a real thing. Research shows that you will go into negative self-talk and overthinking because you are not getting the caloric intake. And so some athletes, when they're trying to be a lower weight, they wait till last week or 2 weeks, they're setting themselves up for an increase in negative self-talk, an increase in cortisol level. And 2 weeks out, they're already underperforming. Like
Right.
the rate that, like, if we were to say what would look like leading into a performance, and maybe they still win, but like it was uncomfortable. They should have won by like minutes compared to the things, right? But that's it. It does everything that you do. And that's why I say like the 3 weeks is like you are eating, drinking, and sleeping. That performance that is that week or day before that is causing, however it's manifesting, how it's somaticized, right? And so some people it's more somatic, physical. Some people it is just more of panic attacks. And then some people they don't even really realize that they have an issue, right? Because they just don't have the coach. It's like they were under trained and they were just going off raw talent. And now they're actually training. And so that just takes a year or two for your mind and body to really just understand and make and connect the dots. So then that can create some anxiety that, you just have to get through, in a way is how I kind of say it, like hitting your head against the wall when you want to race in Europe, right? Or finishing your first crit. Rarely does anyone not just get blown off the back the first time. Or, again, I think it's harder for some athletes when they, from the gun, have a silver spoon, have sponsors, and are doing great, and didn't have that learning curve of being the domestique or,
A lot of bad races and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's what teaches you just as much as working with me or a good coach. Like for me, failure is the good juice. Like I want you swimming in failure, because only by failing do we actually get to the other side. So again, there's always something good out of the future hypothetical anxiety. And how the easiest way to look at it is coulda, shoulda, wouldas is past, and that's depression. And that means comparison, whether it's to yourself or someone else, or I have to, or I need to, or, or comparing to the future hypothetical, that's anxiety. And then we take that and we say, where are you? Remember, like, are you black on the depressive or white on the anxiety? And then we just got to make sure, which everyone hates me saying it, like, trust the process, enjoy the journey. Well, yeah, you should. But I mean, there's days I wake up and I don't want to talk to people, but then 5 minutes, my first patient or client, I'm not thinking that anymore, right? Because I genuinely do love my job. Well, as a pro athlete, either now it's time to retire or you're going to underperform if you don't enjoy riding in the rain or running in the rain, or, but then, again, like, not to digress, then we have to look at like, okay, this athlete doesn't typically have this stressor. Maybe it is that now, they subtracted too much out of their life. Like their identity is not to be just a pro. Because I think a lot of people think that, everything's going to get better when I decide to quit my job and be professional. But maybe that just the importance of the athletic identity to the point where it actually becomes the limiter. Because then it's only that identity.
Yeah, that's a really, really tricky spot for that I've had to manage before being a coach. But I know a lot of other athletes don't consider, or a lot of other emerging elite athletes don't consider when they're trying to make that transition. This is how difficult it is, not only from a practical point of view, how do I make it not having my side job, or how do I make it only as an elite athlete from I got to put food on the table kind of thing.
Exactly.
But also, how do I make it when that's all I'm doing? Like
Exactly.
sitting around playing video games the rest of the day. That's kind of what you should be doing, which is resting.
Right.
And some athletes, some elite are emerging.
Chill, right? I mean, when you're in the hotel room, I mean, that's the best thing to be doing.
Yeah, that's your job at that point. And
it is your job.
Some elite athlete or some emerging elite athletes kind of get that intuitively for whatever reason, but many do not, and they have to have good counsel around them to say it's okay to play video games for 6 hours.
Oh yeah,
it's part of your recovery. Or whatever the activity is.
Yes. And I mean, I usually get athletes where, if I can just text them, like they know but they just need the coach or someone else to give themselves permission. I mean, I'm okay with that. At least then you're not lying, which I mean, a lot of people, I mean, I even saw that when I was racing. I'd go on a training ride. We had just done 5 hours and, there's no reason that now I take back, which I should never have had been training 5 hours, but that was no story. We knew a lot. More is more, was when I raced. Yeah. And then, I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, it just comes back to that kind of just belief and understanding. And I always tell athletes, like, from my standpoint, you get your pro card when you tell your coach, I'm not training today because I need an extra day of recovery. And what is one day? I mean, I think that's the issue. That's the next stage that I've been working on with my athletes, whether they are a doctor and, just want to win the local, master's crit or whatever, is that piece, right there. I mean, it's just understanding that, it's okay to take a break. It's okay to Netflix and chill. Yeah. Are you doing that for 2 weeks without like an injury?
This is a luxury tangent, of talking about how elite athletes can manage this. The fact of the matter is most of the people listening to this are just like normal people.
Right, exactly.
And I kind of want to leave on some direction that we can give those people.
Yep.
Specifically on how to handle this leap.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, once again, pandemic kind of caused disruptions in people's schedules. And so whether they're an experienced athlete or a new athlete alike, when they get into an ultramarathon situation, inevitably there's going to be a jump. There's going to be a jump from the most amount of training, the longest long run, longest whatever, to the actual race. And I kind of want you to leave with specifically, how can an athlete look at their training, look at their self-worth, look at their identity and things like that in order to have that leap not be as problematic from training to the race?
Yeah. Well, and this is kind of a fun activity. I have, and again, like I can't force my athletes to do this, but the ones that do it trend to actually do very well. And I'm not going to say it's because of this one thing, but it works for some athletes. So, and it doesn't have to be like, you can make it as something you just jot down on a piece of paper, or you get a poster board and you make it be kind of like, we call it in psychology world, a vision board, right? Yeah. Where, like you're the middle. And so like, okay, the middle can be your spirit guide. I don't care, the more you make it kind of fun. I'm very empirical evidence, but like I have crystals next to my bed and, wind chimes and, things like that. Because again, like, why not? If it makes me feel happy and empowered or, whatever, it's much better than drinking or, having a bad day at work and just normalizing having red wine, a glass, a cup. Yeah. Which we know now can lead to a bottle, right? And I think that's it. It's like, I offer the idea that like you need to create a vision board where there's the psychological, what are the things that from previous sports or something you and your coach, realize is going on. And it can be really simple, like, figuring out, like, because I am an ER doctor, I'm on my feet, that like I can't do the same training as the other guys on my team, right? Because you're up and you have a stressful job, right? And that stress comes in. So, I mean, it really does start with the ground of that. And the first thing is just visually being able to see these things. And I feel like that's the piece people need to understand, that the visual piece is going to help everyone, whether you are more of an artistic or intellectual person. That's the power of journaling. That's the power of writing this shit down. Because a lot of people don't even want to write this down, because then it feels like, real. It's real, but you're going to perform better, or more chances to perform better, the more real it is. And the first step is to actually write down these goals. But it's not just about sport, right? So, okay, nutrition. What are 3 things you're going to do with your nutrition? That's going to help with alleviating the negative pre-performance anxiety, because it starts with that.
Right.
Performance anxiety in its core is a good thing, because you need to have arousal, right? Butterflies, yes, the person you're married to should still give you butterflies, like every day. You're not in the honeymoon phase, but I mean, you should still be attracted. Maybe it is more intellectual or whatever, but like, yeah, I mean, so there should be some type of attraction. And sports kind of same, like you should most often, and I hate that should's a strong word, but in sports, when your job is to be of a performance base, that's where the shoulds are allowed, right? Like, yes, you have to do X, Y, Z to be in the top 5 of your sport, right? Or to have realistic objectives. And so first step is figuring out just your heart and soul, what you want to do. And then you talk to the realist, you talk to your coach, and it's like, okay, yes, are you ever going to make the Tour de France team? Probably not, but what is going to help you be at least getting to Cat 1, right? Or at least being able to, complete an ultra, right? Which, I mean, a lot of people, and this is where I don't know, and you can tell me, like, what's like, how much experience of being a runner does it take to finish an ultra? Not like try to win or be sponsored, just to complete the ultra distance.
Well, and that's what I was kind of getting at. It's not as much as people think, and people blow it up in their heads that, I need 20 years of running and to train for 20 hours a week and to do a 100-kilometer long run before I do a 100-mile run or whatever they've got kind of like cooked up in
just
their
like
head.
People go and do centuries. And I mean, these are people that look like they have never ridden their bike ever in their life, and they're able to go do a century.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that experience is not helpful. It is.
Oh, yeah.
It's tremendously helpful. But the prerequisites for completing an ultra marathon in terms of what you need to have on your palmares or, race resume or whatever are really not that high. It's a very accessible sport where you can
and a beautiful. I mean, like you can do the trails, and I mean, like there's a lot of more positives, and that's where that starts too. Again, at the top would be like, why are you doing this? Yeah. And what are your outcomes? What do you want besides, like, if there's a placement one, great, write that on there, and that can kind of be at the top. But how I work, it's how can sport, just like in high school, I love high school sport, I love college sport, because again, like, you're able to learn these life lessons through sport. And I think as adults, or the older we get, we forget that, like, just like it's an entertainment, that this is just like, hopefully the job you choose to do is something where it's forever a growth mindset, right? Like, I always want you to be mastering and not be the master. Like you want to choose a sport or a job where, you are constantly looking for outlets to better yourself, not strangling it, right? Where it's cyclocentric, where, everything, your whole identity and self-worth is around it. And that's easier to do when we actually like create a vision board where it's like, all right, relationships, what area, what am I doing good? All right, my marriage is doing great, but we haven't been on a vacation in 2 years. Well, maybe you need to go on a vacation. Again, it's like going out on top. Like, what are things that are great and working for you? And then how can you apply those to the areas where you start to, you have a trait anxiety that turns into a trait, a state, then turns into that trait, and it's often turns negative. Right.
It almost sounds like a map. Like a lot of trail runners are used to like looking at Gaia, the trail maps and things like that. Okay, I want to go from point X to point Z, and I'm going to take this trail over there.
Well, and I don't want to be, like too cutesy, but I usually, it's a wheel. And if the hub isn't there, it doesn't hold the spikes up, right? Yeah. And so you kind of can think about it visually as that. It's like, for every race that you do, the wheel can somewhat turn, but I want all the spokes to be there, at least, touched on or worked on, mastered at least, the hub, you feel ready. And then you just said something beautiful, was like, that's what is exciting about the ultras or hiking or whatever, is that, the other things of, looking at a map and, you're going to stop at AIDS and like take the AIDS and, sit for a second if you need to, or, whatever. It's an adventure.
This is a beautiful place to leave it, because I've always thought that for athletes who have completed an ultra, they have all the tools.
Oh God. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's bad that you get nervous before a race, or it's bad that you have performance anxiety or whatever. But because you've been through that experience, you've had all the tools. In addition to that, because you've trained for it, you also have all the tools.
Exactly.
And you remember that and go back and review your training and how meaningful it is to you and what all these training things were done. And those two things combined.
And that's why it's good to keep a training journal.
Yeah. Not just a training log.
Not just a training log. Yes. And taking notes, because your time is valuable. And I think a lot of times we talk to coaches, again, it's that famous saying, are you listening with the intent to reply, or are you really listening?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, and I think a lot of times it's just human nature, is that we don't want to hear that it's going to take work, or that, those are great goals. It may take a while. Hey, and I love when people prove me wrong. I mean, it's not a fight. I mean, I don't need to be right. Prove me wrong. But I tend to have aspirations one step beyond my clients, because that's just, I need to have my own goals. Do I ever tell the athlete it? No, but I let them know, like, oh, well, you made it this far because I knew you could. Yeah. And again, like, I don't know if that's like a sixth sense. I don't know what it is. It's just something, which is why I think I'm good as a therapist, that I read people, energies, and I've been around the block a lot with hundreds of humans. So I kind of know what to compare. And like, your ultra running is yeah, it's its own culture. But like you said, I think the best thing you said that I now can take away, because it was an assumption that I made, is that people tend to overthink what they need to do well at ultra if they were a sprinter.
It's enough. I mean, trust me, I could look at 100 different training programs from ultra runners, whether they're contrived by our coaches or they do it themselves or they're following a plan. And I can look at it and go, yeah, you can be successful in it. Here's how, it all kind of like maps out. But in the runner's head, for a myriad of reasons, it should be 2x, whatever they did. So if everybody could take away that you've done it, I kind of feel like Stuart Smiley, right? That old SNL character, right? You get enough, you're smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like you. There's an application in endurance training to that, to where your trainings first off, you can't change it, but it's going to be enough. And you're going to figure it out on race day and give yourself a little bit.
And that's the coolest part, remind yourself of that. Remind yourself as like, if we grow up in the 80s or, anything before like, the internet, I mean, that was how we did it. We just went out there, and on Saturdays you rode your bike and you got lost or you got bitten by the neighbor's dog or whatever. Like that's the beauty of it, is that first you don't have anxiety with something that you don't want to do well at. So that's a good thing, right? That just means it's important to you. Yeah. And often I think that helps a lot of my clients, just that simple thing. Oh, I'm nervous because it means something. And that means I have done the work. Yeah. And then, whatever outcome, it's then, your best next race is only going to go as if, what you learned from the previous race. There's no bad races, except for, don't ever quit unless you're injured, and don't be stupid and keep running or whatever. Right. Because then, that mentally and physiologically is no. So if anyone takes that away, like
we got our grounds covered there.
There you go. Just don't quit unless in the back of your head, you should quit.
Yeah. Dr. K, thank you for coming back on the podcast. I'm glad we could.
Oh man, I think sorry if we didn't go down the route that you intended, because I know I can kind of jump around sometimes.
It's all good. And I think, I'll go through this during the intro. And so listeners will already have heard this. A lot of times with sports psychology, people want like a definitive framework. And that's my bias too, because I'm a framework person. Like I want A, B, C, D. And in reality, you have to understand concepts first, and then you can use a loose framework to apply those concepts second. And I hope that that's kind of what comes out of this conversation.
Well, and if anyone wants to work with me, I mean, that's the cool thing that I think why, again, if an athlete doesn't want to work with me because I work with someone else, that's fine. But that also to me shows lack of confidence, because if you're truly confident, you would know that like that coach or that sports psychologist, I never talk about another athlete. I never talk about how are you going to beat this person, because then you're giving them the power, right? Everything needs to be about you. Now, if your coach wants to go and look at their files or physiologically figure something out, great. But like I would say to that coach, just don't, just kind of have it like be like the like I say, a shadow figures next to you. Yes, this is what your competitors are at, and this is how I'm going to framework it. But don't, one person against one person, or and that's kind of how it is. It's like I went to school, lots and lots of hours. And I think that, again, I'm still working on myself, still uncomfortable for me to talk about my strengths. But, when I first started out, yes, it was more, like, this is how I'm going to apply this.
Right. Yeah.
I'm learning how to do this. Now, when I sit with someone, there's extensive paperwork, but like, I can tell right now, if someone is reaching out to me at a certain age of a certain sex and they are a 1 in all the areas and the 5 is like in a bad place, most likely they probably should be circling all those 5s. And within like the first 30 minutes of a session, I call BS on the paperwork, right? Because I've worked long enough where no one is a 1 and then wants to talk to a sports psychologist. I'll just leave it at that.
That's a good insight into your practice and who's seeking you.
And that's why when people go see another sports psychologist or a mental trainer who isn't clinically trained, it is going to be a lot more cut and dry. Like, all right, we're going to work on self-talk and imagery. Well, the athletes that come to me who want to win the Tour de France or the Olympics, like, you already are doing it or you wouldn't be there, right?
Yeah,
so that's it. Like, you have the tools, and I would say to the listeners out there, do a vision board, figure out first what you're good at, what's your why, and then you and your coach from your last race or your last sport, like I have high schoolers, they're better swimmers, but they run track. It's like, okay, well, what do you do good in swimming? All right. I need to understand on your best workouts, on your best day, who you are, and like visually having that. And then wherever your, home gym is, have that vision board or have a Post-it note.
Yeah. It's a constant reminder of where you're at and where you want to go.
And we need that. We think we put too much on ourselves to just think that, oh, well, I'm broken, or, I can never do this, which is like the self-loathing, kind of idea where it's like, no, like, but you can't do it alone. So that's why I'll end with, it takes a village.
Yep. I love it. That's a great place to end, Dr. Keim. All right, folks, there you have it. There you go. Much thanks to Kristin for coming back on the podcast. And more importantly, thank you for being such a wealth of information and a critical resource for athletes around the world to lean on. Athletes that use Kristin as part of their village to become better are always happier racers. And as Kristin always likes to say, happy racers go faster. If you have not heard the original podcast that I had with Kristin, where that is the particular theme of it, a link to that will be in the show notes. Y'all go and check it out. I appreciate the heck out of all the listeners out there. If you like this particular podcast, go ahead, share it with your friends, share it with your training partners, and hopefully it enhances their racing and their lives as well. That is it for today, folks. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.